There's a lot of misconceptions in the retail investment community around level one options as a specific SoFi feature and why some companies overarchingly, like Robinhood, can innovate much faster than companies like SoFi. And in this video, I'm going to make an attempt to explain why some of that is misguided and why there's a lot more beneath the surface around these features and these releases, and why some companies just naturally seem to move faster than others as a result of the decisions that they made in architecting their product. So let's jump right in. As many of you who follow the channel may already know, this channel is something that I do for fun in my free time because I'm interested in the vertical and I'm interested in learning more about these companies that I'm invested in. And I can keep myself accountable to learning more about these companies in my investment portfolio by making videos about them and sharing my thoughts on this. But in the last 7 to 8 years, my day job has been in software development and product management specifically. In the last 4 years, I've been leading entire product departments, whether that's hiring and firing, scaling teams, scaling SaaS businesses in particular through product innovation and multi year strategic roadmaps. And this conversation topic came up in the last SoFi Weekly on Friday, where I explained a little bit in the live stream, but I really wanted to dig deeper and make a full video on it. And partially because I think the best way to fully understand the concept is to be able to concisely break it down for others who are not of that subject matter domain in such a way that it makes sense. And so I wanted to share this in a video with you. And I just want to have a disclaimer off the bat that about 70% of this is going to be just overarching concepts, and only about 30% is going to be SoFi related. But it's meant to give you a primer on some of these important behind the scenes ideas. Now, in thinking about this video, I wanted to break it down into a couple of smaller conversations, talking about the technical difficulties in the architecture, the culture around product development, the overall business direction and strategy, and some other topics in between. And I know that after I release this video that people might still disagree, but my goal here is simply to shed some more light on a complex topic because I think the assumption is that people think this is really easy to do. And of course, I don't have access to any of SoFi's information, any of Robinhood's information around how they release product operationally, nor do I have any insight on their internal processes or their internal culture. I'm only speculating using these concepts in software development and also the information that's publicly available through the internet. And I drew this all out on a whiteboard, so let's just start off immediately there. Okay, so first and foremost, let's start off with the shipping culture. And with regards to the shipping culture, I'm talking about this culture of product management, of releasing features quickly, of gathering data, and of iterating on that data. It focuses on adding value to the end user as soon as possible. And really, in the live stream, I use this example of a skateboard MVP. So let's imagine that you have a prompt, you have a company, and the company is releasing a new product. And the goal of the product is to get the consumer or the user from point A to point B. And as a company, you can then assume that, okay, well, if I want to get them from point A to point B, I got to build them a car. And essentially, here you're just jumping to the conclusion that they need a car. And maybe that's an assumption from your part, or maybe that's as a result of some testing that you've done with users. But, anyways, let's say you start production of that car. You source the materials, you build out the engine block, you build out the chassis, you build out the transmission, you create the production line. And throughout the process of an entire year, at the end of that year, you haven't really released anything. You've just been building behind the scenes. And then at the end of the year, you release a car and the product sells and the user is happy. Now, that's one way to do it. But now imagine company number two. Now, company number two here is focused on very quickly gathering ideas, gathering feedback from the user. So, very quickly, within a week, they can build a skateboard and it has four plastic wheels, it has a metal axle, and it's a piece of wood that people stand on. Now, this product is not very comfortable. It's not very fast. It's not very safe, but it gets the user from point A to point B. It meets a minimum viable product, an MVP. People will start using it. People will start buying it. And then objections arise. You get feedback from your users saying, I can't steer this thing. So then you add a second version, which has a handlebar. And then it turns into a scooter. And people can stand and they can steer, and it's more maneuverable. And then that takes you another several weeks to release that scooter. And then more users are happy, but they have more objections. They say, I'm tired. I want to sit. This is not very comfortable. And you get to a bike. You have a seat, you have some pedals, and it's a little bit better than the scooter. And it still meets the need of getting you from point A to point B, and so on and so forth, right? Then you get another objection saying, well, the bike is kind of slow. It's not really that fast. And so you add an engine and you make it a little bit more comfortable and it meets a little bit more user needs and it's applicable to more of the market. So then you have like a moped or a motorcycle. And so that takes another couple of months to achieve. And then you get more feedback from your user base who says, well, I want to travel with my family and I can't really have them all sitting on the motorcycle. And it's also difficult when it rains and it's bad weather conditions, and so on and so forth. And then you eventually keep adding to your product offering until you end up with the same end result as the first company did. But throughout that entire process, let's say for both companies, it takes a course of a year, both companies ended up with a car as their end result. Both companies are able to get the user from point A to point B, but the first company worked entirely behind the scenes for that whole first year, gathering no feedback from the end user, eventually releasing something they thought the market would like. And the fact is, a lot of companies operate this way today. But the reality is, for all successful companies, they are gathering feedback from their users to consistently validate what they're building to make sure that they're still on track. Users might say they want one thing, they might actually need something entirely different. And that's when you isolate for the problem. And that's a lot of what I do in my day job. But also, there's a big risk of running your business this way because over the course of that 1 year, while you're building in the background, the market expectations might change for what they're looking for. In the case of Company 2, for example, the timeline until the full release was similar, but because they're consistently releasing small, minimum viable products, they're able to collect feedback from users and implement that feedback into following iterations and be more in tune with their user base throughout that entire process. So here we can see that the first company has a very long development cycle and risks creating the wrong end product, whereas the second company releases very quickly and it's not perfect, but it's usable. And they're also able to pivot based on user feedback, right? Because the only way we get to Scooter is by getting the feedback from the users to say, I want the ability to steer this thing more so than I want the ability to sit down. And so, as a company releasing product consistently, you're also covered on that perspective because your users will prioritize for you on what their next biggest pain point is. And it's a good illustration of this waterfall versus this agile methodology. In software development, a waterfall methodology is where one thing cannot happen until the thing before it happens. So think of like an assembly line. The car can't be painted until the pieces are assembled, and the pieces can't be assembled until the pieces are created, so on and so forth. Whereas in an agile methodology, it's much more based on testing, on quick iterations, where many different components are being built and tested and released at the same time. Because as a company, you're consistently validating this new offering while you're building it. You're driving the car as you're building the car is a very popular expression. And in the first case, you sort of build something, and then only after you release it do you validate it to the market. And there's a huge risk there. Whereas in the second example, you validate while you're building. Now, let's bring this to SoFi. Right now, SoFi's bank charter might make them a lot more risk averse. They might have stricter compliance. They might have more regulatory adherence to go before launch. And this really increases their timeline of them working behind the scenes. And in this video, I also broke out the actual releases that SoFi has. And there was a year in 2019 where they released like 5 or 6 different products. Those products didn't take a month to build. They took maybe many years to build, but they were building all of those products behind the scenes. And I think the shipping culture at SoFi has improved quite a bit. I think it's better than this. Like they're releasing stuff to gather feedback. And one common example of this is like when they release their new credit cards, they would release it to a small beta group of customers before releasing it to a wider group. But it's still an iterative process. It's still something that can get better and better because the risk you run is releasing something and putting your logo and your reputation behind something that is not really applicable to the end user and then risking losing that end user altogether. So you have to strike a fine balance of what is good enough from a functionality perspective, but what is also good enough to actually associate with your logo and your reputation as a company. So the second aspect here is around regulatory constraints. And I just wanted to draw the flow of options trading specifically so you can understand everything that happens at a high level when a user places an options trade on the SoFi Invest app. And I just want to highlight right now a disclaimer that I'm by no means a financial expert, and this is through a lot of Googling and a lot of just research online that I've done over the past 24 hours. But one thing that I really want to get through here is that options trading is something that's complex and it's something that you need rigorous compliance around. You can't just slap a UI on something and have 5 engineers in a room for a week and it's done. 95%, if not more, is actually all behind the scenes of what happens that the user doesn't see, but it just actually works. So let's say you have the SoFi app here and you place a trade, right? You select the option chain you want, you select the number of contracts you're willing to trade, and you click submit. So what happens when you click submit? Well, that goes to SoFi's backend servers, okay? What do SoFi's backend servers do? So the backend servers here, really what they do is they authenticate the user, they verify the account status, they verify all of the available funds in that account, like does Tevis, who's trying to make this trade? Does he have enough funds in his account? Does he have enough margin capacity in his account to be able to cover that trade in the first place? And then they do risk and compliance checks. So basically, they perform risk management checks to make sure that this trade aligns with my risk profile. Does it align with my account balance? Does it align with my trading option level? Like if this is not enabled for me, then I won't be able to make this trade in the first place and it's going to be limited. And a lot of these compliance checks just ensure that this is good to go from a regulatory perspective. This is all set by the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the FINRA, which is the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. So after all the checks and balances have been made and the trade is good to go, then what happens? Then the trade is routed to a third-party clearing firm. So in the case of SoFi here, I'm making the assumption that all of this would go through Apex. This is the third-party clearing firm that they're working with. And if they were to roll out level one options, then this is the entity that they would need to integrate with in the future. In the case that they're not using Apex or a third-party clearing firm, then SoFi would essentially send that order directly to the options exchange, like the CBOE or any market maker. But let's assume for a second that they are using Apex because I'm pretty sure that they are. So essentially here, Apex, what it's going to do is it's going to route my order to a counterparty so that it gets executed. Let's say I'm buying 10 options contracts. It's going to find the person who is selling 10 options contracts with that same strike price at that same price. Once the counterparty is found through the exchange will then confirm the trade and send the trade confirmation details back to the clearing firm, being Apex. So it's essentially executing the trade. Now, once the trade is executed, you have a settlement where essentially the funds or the shares trade hands. The OCC acts as a central clearinghouse and guarantees the transaction and manages the settlement. So usually T+1, so the trading day, plus 1 business day for the actual funds to change hands. And once the trade has been executed and once the trade has been settled, only then does it go back to SoFi's backend to update the user account. So the user account is updated and reflecting the executed trade. So Tevis bought X number of contracts at X premium. This is the change to his cash and the change to his margin. And this is the now contract that he owns. It's visible in my account. There's also some record keeping that has to happen here where the trade details are all logged in SoFi's internal systems for record keeping and auditing purposes, because SoFi is going to report this trade to regulatory bodies like FINRA. This is required from all these brokers to ensure transparency and compliance with regulations. And finally, this is going to go through my app and it's just going to show me from a front end that the trade has been executed. And this is now my new balance and my new options contract that I have purchased. I'm likely going to get a notification in app or a notification through email for this. So this is the entire process by which the options trading and selling happens, by which stock trading and selling happens. It just goes to different market makers. And again, I might be missing certain components here because I am not a subject matter expert in this specific field. But at a high level, this is how it happens. It goes from their backend to a clearinghouse, and then that clearinghouse routes to the market makers and it gets executed and it gets settled, so on and so forth. Now, there's a couple of potential issues here. So essentially, SoFi is going to have stricter capital requirements. They're going to have stricter risk assessment. They're going to have stricter compliance audits than somebody like Robinhood would because they are a chartered bank. We saw back in 2021, Robinhood getting a little bit of hot water with regards to risk management around this specifically, which received some regulatory backlash. So there's a lot of regulatory considerations for SoFi as a bank. They have to have higher reserves as a bank. They have to assess risk differently as a bank than brokerages. But even aside from the fact that SoFi is a heavily regulated chartered bank and Robinhood is not as heavily regulated because it's a brokerage, you have to also account for the technical complexity of integrating with a third party, such as Apex Clearinghouse, number one. And then number two, you have to account for the business decision because let's just say that on their roadmap for development, SoFi wants to vertically integrate their own clearinghouse. They want to acquire somebody and they want to integrate them in-house. Why would then SoFi spend all of this time optimizing this flow with a third party when they're just going to bring somebody in-house later on down the line? So that could obviously be one of the reasons why a level one options would be deprioritized in that roadmap. And I'm going to double tap on that point later on in the video, but really I've prioritized multiple roadmaps and I generally do it through a couple of different vectors. One of them being the technical complexity, i.e. how difficult is this to build? What is the risk associated with building this? And then the other vector being user feedback, obviously. The other vector being business direction in general. Is this where our company wants to go holistically speaking from a top-down proactive strategy? So there obviously is that reactive component of like, what are our users asking for? And then there's that other component of where do we as a business want to go? And then there's that obviously technical component of how difficult is this to even build in the first place? Is this something that we can build or buy? Okay, so let's now move on to topic number three. And just before I do this, I just also want to remind you one more time that a lot of this stuff, I don't know that this is the case for SoFi behind the scenes. I am just speculating, but I am just trying to provide a framework from a purely educational point of view. And if you like this content, please subscribe to the channel for more. So the third piece here is difficulties around integrating acquisitions. This is something that I've encountered personally as I've been part of acquisitions in the past. And whenever two companies are integrating, it's a mess waiting to happen. So in the case of Galileo and Technisys, for example, I mean, Galileo specializes in fintech payments infrastructure, Technisys on core banking software. And one of the challenges here immediately off the bat is that they could potentially have had different tech stacks that require architectural restructuring to work together in the first place. Other challenges include the fact that engineering teams now have to adopt new tools, they have to adopt new processes, they have to adopt new leadership structures. So, for example, here, does SoFi, I didn't finish the sentence, but does SoFi dictate the roadmap? Because if SoFi internally dictates what Galileo is going to build, then that's obviously a big conflict of interest. And that to me tells a story that Galileo's primary function is to be the infrastructure for SoFi, and their secondary function is to sell to other companies. But if SoFi is treated just as a single client in Galileo's roadmap prioritization sessions, and SoFi does not dictate that entire roadmap, then that obviously tells a different story around the priorities around that roadmap in general. And one other major thing to consider is this loss of contextual knowledge. Because one thing that I have encountered in the past, as I've gone through these acquisitions myself, is generally speaking, you'll have a lot of people, key developers, generally key designers, key product people, that leave post acquisition. And this makes it very much harder to maintain and improve the acquired technology. Because if critical Galileo engineers left after Galileo was acquired, or if critical Technisys engineers left after Technisys was acquired, then SoFi's ability to modify its own backend for invest features would obviously slow down. Galileo's roadmap would obviously slow down. Why would these people leave? Well, imagine you just got a massive payday and all of a sudden all of your shares were liquidated because there's a liquidation event there. Then obviously you would be incentivized to leave, because for a lot of businesses, being acquired is the end goal. That's when their shares are actually worth something. And so a lot of teams do leave after acquisitions, and that is really difficult when it comes to integrating those acquisitions. Now, this is actually one slide that I made in my day job when we were walking through an acquisition, and why we had to consider all of these different aspects. So you have product alignment here to make sure that the portfolios work together. So you can imagine this in Galileo and Technisys' case. You have customer impact. So what's the overlap between those customers and what do we need to tell those customers post merger? What are their concerns? Technological impacts. How does the technology stack differ? Cultural and talent alignment. So how do we make sure that we can retain key talent and promote growth in the combined companies? How do we merge these two cultures together? Brand positioning around the value proposition in general. And that's something that a lot of people don't even think about, is how do you consolidate all the documentation and all the processes to keep what's working and scrap what isn't working? How do you maintain transparent communication with stakeholders throughout that integration process? How do you identify key risks in your business across that integration process? And then how do you align financial systems and reporting structures for accurate performance tracking? Like, how do we make sure that who reports to who? What is the new function? And you saw some of this because management was talking about merging Galileo and Technisys' backend, and how that merger was taking a lot of time from a technical perspective because they're going from on-prem to cloud. And you also saw some layoffs in January or February, I think, of last year, where they laid off, I think, like 5% of their headcount. And a lot of it was as a result of redundancies in this system. And so they were going through these steps in real time. And you can see how that can take up a lot of effort, and it can make it very difficult for these companies to release new features on a consistent basis. So that's the third point, is integration challenges when you're acquiring new companies. Now let's go to the fourth point, which is a legacy code base. Now here I want to talk about a monolithic versus a microservice architecture, which I talked about a little bit during that live stream, but I really want to illustrate the point home. So a lot of small businesses have this monolithic structure where everything is under one roof. So let's say here you're building an online travel booking web app. And this is going to have hotel booking, flight booking, train booking. It's going to have a payment processing side, and it's going to have obviously account and user management. All of this in a monolithic design is built under one singular roof. And that makes it easy, and it makes it difficult for different reasons. So in the case of the monolithic design, the application is one single unified system. All the code that you build for every single feature ends up in one code base. You deploy the entire code base as a single unit. You have only one technology stack that you're using for the whole app. Some of the benefits here is that it's easier to develop, it's easier to manage. This is why it's a preferred choice for a lot of small businesses because essentially you can run all of your tests in one go, all of your deployments in one app, everything is on one roof, it's less complex, so on and so forth. Now, some of the challenges is that you have a single point of failure, basically one bug across one of these different modules can crash the entire system. Redeployment is difficult because small changes require full app redeployment. You have scaling issues. Obviously, this is why most large companies have moved to a microservice approach. You can't scale because the costs and the risks are too high. And you have high dependency because the code is interdependent on each other. And so what happened was just a little history lesson. Back in 2011, Netflix was one of the first adopters of a microservice approach. They were built on a monolith. That monolith was unable to scale. It struggled to handle this increasing traffic. And so in 2011, they shifted to a microservice approach where they basically broke up their massive application into much smaller, scalable, independent services. And this really revolutionized the way that large scale applications handle scalability and flexibility and user experience to this day. Atlassian is another example that I wanted to highlight here because Atlassian here moved into a microservice approach in 2018 after they faced growing and scaling challenges with Jira and Confluence. We found that a single tenant monolithic architecture running on premise would not be able to scale to future needs. And so they essentially re-architected here by moving to a microservice approach all the way here in 2018. This was our largest infrastructure project to date, taking 2 years to complete the transition to AWS, migrating more than 100,000 customers in just over 10 months with no service interruptions. Because that's the other thing. It's like you're also going to move all of the databases and all the components, but how do you make sure that you do that without having service interruptions? You can't just turn the app off for a year while you work on it, right? And the point that I want to make here is twofold. Number one, that a lot of businesses have done this late. Like this approach was a real option in 2011, but Atlassian, which is a massive company, only did it in 2018. And number two, that it takes so long to do these things because you have to make sure that you don't have any service interruptions while you're actually doing that. In the case of Atlassian, for example, it took them 2 years to complete this transition and over 10 months to complete that migration alone. And so you can think for SoFi and for Galileo, this transition alone would take them years to do. And we know that SoFi was a monolithic structure back in the early days because Anthony Noto was not in the CEO seat. And there was a lot of interconnected pieces for SoFi. So at some point in their journey, they have gone through this microservice approach. And let me just explain what that microservice approach is so you have a better idea. So essentially, this was the structure of the monolithic design. This is how it would look in a microservice approach. Every service is independent of the other. Every service can be built in a different tech stack. Every service is divided into a smaller independent component. They all have their own code base. They all have their own development team. They all have their own database. They all have their own CI/CD pipeline. And all of this means that you can update each individual service independent of the other without affecting the entire application. You can make changes to one service without redeploying to the whole system. You can scale services. Like if you have a flash sale on plane tickets, for example, you can scale that up to handle all that volume while keeping the other services the same. And more importantly, you have technological flexibility. What that means is each service has an independent code base. You can write different services in different technologies based on what that service is doing and what tech stack suits that service best. And then you can adopt those new technologies as the best tool for the job. And so all of these can be written in entirely different languages, but they still all work together because they're all independent of each other. Now, it's important here to highlight that both SoFi and Robinhood use a microservice approach. But when they adopted this microservice approach was very, very different. And my guess is that Hood did so much, much earlier. And really, in order to explain why, what I did was I went through and I looked at the entire history of both companies in terms of what they have released since inception over the past 15 years. So here you can see that Robinhood was founded in 2013. They launched their brokerage account in 2015, instant deposits in 2016, Robinhood Gold the same year, options trading in 2017, and they launched crypto in 2018. And as we go down the list here, we can see that a lot of the stuff that they've launched have been improvements or essentially features on the back of this brokerage platform. And so here you have IPO shares, more crypto offerings. They acquired a couple of companies. They launched the cash card for Robinhood. They added extended hours trading. They added retirement accounts. They acquired X1 that they rebranded to the Robinhood card. They added index options, futures, Robinhood Legends, so on and so forth. And a lot of this is just features based on this brokerage platform. And so that's an important caveat here to highlight. SoFi was founded in 2011. They launched mortgage lending in 2014, personal loans in 2015, SoFi at Work in 2016, student loan refinancing in 2017. This entire amount of time is my best guess that SoFi was a monolithic structure. Why? Because of the pace of their launches and because all of these are within the lending segment entirely. Anthony Noto joined in 2018, and immediately 2019, I think, was their most prolific product year, where they launched SoFi Money, Relay Invest, home loans, in-school loans, and the entire SoFi app in general was launched in 2019. This would be my best guess as to when they began having that microservice approach. And granted, I don't know any of this, but my guess here would be that a lot of this stuff was built in a microservice way, like independent services, but this was entirely still a monolith up here, where they're releasing new features, but they're also integrating with this very legacy code base here. Then they acquired Galileo in 2020. They kept launching, right? They kept launching credit cards, SoFi Rewards, so on and so forth. Like this was a really prolific period where they were launching things left and right. They launched auto loan refinancing through a partnership, and then they got their bank charter, launched checking and savings, margin trading, options trading in 2022. So immediately for option trading, just on a baseline, you have it in 2017 for Robinhood and 2022 for SoFi. So it's 5 years behind as it stands. They launched crypto in the same year, and then they acquired Technisys for 1.1 billion. Guess would be a lot of this time period here was integrating Technisys and Galileo from a back-end perspective. And so a lot of this time here would be back-end related stuff. There's actually blog posts that I found for SoFi where their developers were writing about new product launches that go back to 2022 that mentioned their microservice approach. So we know that they had microservices as early as 2022. My guess again would be 2019 is when they started doing that, just because of this launch right here. But I would imagine that a lot of this started out as a big pile of monolithic structure. And all of that is going to hurt you down the line. So that's also one of the reasons why it could be that SoFi has not launched this level 1 options yet, because they have a lot of tech debt relative to something like Robinhood, which literally started out as a brokerage from day one. They launched their options in 2017, and the options was a high priority feature because it's relevant to their core value proposition. SoFi's core value proposition, by contrast, is being a one-stop shop. They have a very basic version of everything as step one. So SoFi was likely a monolithic architecture until Noto joined, like I said. And the reason why is because they had no FinServe and they had no tech platform when Noto joined. The Galileo integration took a long time because it was a big thing to start integrating. And SoFi only started using Galileo in 2024. So that should be another hint for you right there. And then the fourth point here is that SoFi has way more swim lanes working simultaneously. Like imagine this multi-lane highway that has a lot of traffic and you're trying to merge through that traffic, you're trying to weave through, versus Robinhood is a brokerage and they're just releasing new features on that brokerage. It's like a single lane expressway. You can move much faster because you're not crossing through different lanes. And that brings us to the fifth and final point that I have in this video, because like most of my videos, this one is running incredibly long. And that point, and possibly the most important point here, is the strategic vision and dependencies. So I just drew out here SoFi's platform, how I see it, with lending and financial services being two pillars, and with the tech platform being the thing that powers lending and financial services, but also offers their services to other B2B clients. And here, I drew this big box, and this big box was SoFi Plus. And the reason why is because of this last point here, where SoFi's core value proposition is this one-stop shop, and SoFi Plus, as I see it personally, is going to be that connective tissue, the thing that connects all of their product offerings together. And all I'm advocating for by drawing this diagram is the strategic vision that SoFi management has and the dependencies they have in terms of other features that they want to launch is a big core reason why we don't have level 1 options yet. Because if you're trying to be a one-stop shop, the value proposition is the ecosystem. As a result, just logically speaking, you're more incentivized to go very wide versus very deep. You're more incentivized to have a basic offering of everything and invite people into that ecosystem than have one thing really well, but then lack all of these other aspects of that ecosystem, because that ecosystem is the main value proposition of your business. The other thing here, when you keep that in mind, is that there's more lucrative opportunities elsewhere in that ecosystem. Anthony Noto himself mentioned this with saying, hey, SoFi Plus was more lucrative for us to launch. Loan platform business deals are more lucrative for them to explore. Interest-only personal loans is more lucrative of a product offering for them to offer. And so you have to keep that in mind as well. Like internally, they could be arguing, why should we be focusing all of our efforts on level 1 options when we can actually make way more money and also have a bigger strategic alignment with these other initiatives? Now, the last point that I want to bring up here is reprioritization, because I've done this in many different companies. And usually how it worked is we did quarterly reprioritization sessions with the entire senior leadership team. And we always had our company goal in mind. We always had a proactive aspect of saying, hey, what do we want to focus on this year, guys? Do we want to focus on profitability? Do we want to focus on new customer acquisition? Do we want to focus on customer retention? Do we want to focus on new product launches in general? Do we want to focus on capturing market share relative to our competitors? And what we always had was we always had 10x the amount of features in our backlog, in our to-do list, than we had in our yearly roadmap, because we just could not fit all of those initiatives in our yearly roadmap per the resources that we had. If I did nothing at my company for the next 10 years, we would have sufficient features to keep the engineering team busy for the next 10 years. But the fact is, the company would build a whole bunch of stuff that has no purpose in the wider strategic vision. It had no alignment, and probably we would not end up being as profitable or capture as much market share, because all of those ideas need to be validated and all of those requests need to be reprioritized based on what users are asking for, and also based on that internal strategic vision of where we want to drive the business this year, and also based on macro trends and what's happening in the macro and what can we capitalize on in the macro. SoFi's internal management team probably reprioritizes like a monthly basis or at least a quarterly basis. When they're thinking about their roadmap ahead, SoFi's internal management team already knows every single feature that they're going to build in 2025. I would be shocked if that were not the case. They already know everything that they're going to build. They've already made a decision on everything that they're going to build way ahead of time. Probably what happened was level one options was on the roadmap, top of mind in 2022 or maybe 2023, and it got deprioritized because they were seeing better traction on these other product offerings. And so that's all I'm trying to say is, this business, you have to take into account where they're going in terms of what they want to reprioritize as to what gets them there faster. In conclusion, what I'm trying to say here is that there's many factors that go into play as to why certain features may be very straightforward, very easy to release, and why they're not released yet. We started off talking about the shipping and testing cultures with the skateboard MVP and with waterfall versus agile. We talked about the complexity of the task itself, where we broke down the actual flow of where a trade goes once you hit execute. In companies that I've consulted at, we would always rate our features based on the ROI relative to the technical complexity and also relative to the strategic alignment that it had with where the business wanted to go. We talked about tech debt of existing architecture. We talked about absorbing new acquisitions and the difficulty with integrating new teams. And we also talked about legacy tech debt by highlighting monolithic versus microservice approaches and the fact that SoFi moved to a microservice approach much later than Robinhood did. And finally, we talked about the strategic vision, going deep versus going wide, and reprioritization in this product roadmap. And again, like I said, I don't know the exact reason why SoFi hasn't released level one options yet. I can only speculate with the information that I have available. And having been somebody in a position to reprioritize certain features to drive strategic alignment in the businesses that I've consulted in, this is the thought process of how I would approach that problem. And so I just wanted to make this video to share with you the fact that, number one, it's not as easy as some people online make it seem. Number two, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that you don't see. And number three, this could be very well a conscious decision that management is making and not just something that they're stumbling over on a daily basis. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was educational for you. That was my main goal in this video, was to make something educational and something that aligns my desire to talk about fintech with also my expertise in product management. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.